Hello everyone, today we continue our third volume of what was in theory to be a single video about medieval central northern Italian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century for our military regional series. We still have to finish the introduction, but today I think that we will, and then we will pass to the also pretty hefty iconographic and archaeological evidence. So I think that all in all it will take 4 videos in total to cover this, even just as an introduction. And we have explained the reasons, right? This is by far one of the most developed and documented, and probably as a combination the most, right? Say context in medieval European warfare as a whole, right? And definitely not exaggerating. We have touched on different topics, and last time we were especially looking at sort of the later phase of this Italian military development towards the so-called era of the free companies, right? The soldiers of fortune and the Condottieri. We were observing specifically the toughening of armor towards the mid-14th centuries was almost global, like this Eurasian civilized trend, right? There were less fighters around, but the few that were out there were very well paid by the overarching elite. This is probably the moment of the affirmation of the ancien regime that, in fact, used these mercenaries at large, equipping them with the finest panoply, in a moment in which cavalry was actually regaining ground in the medieval art of war, right? There is no greater lie than the progressive rise in importance of infantry, even in the late medieval period, right? Especially the mid-14th century is a moment of heavy sort of re-feudalization, re-chivalrization or equestrianization, terrible words I know, of warfare, right? We were talking about the consequent decline of infantry already from, say, the 20s, the 30s of the 14th century. It starts being clear in Italy. These massive infantry armies with tens of thousands of men sort of shrink dramatically. It's important to stress that the numbers in many ways were still there. It's not like the population, doesn't matter how hard things like the Black Death and the cyclical reappearance of the same in the following years would strike the inhabitants. What we tend, that's a too mechanistic, structuralistic, deterministic, mechanistic explanation. People actually were obviously there, and there would have been, of course, room for them to still go in at war. But what really changes, in a by far larger degree, is of course the mindset, right? Is the fear of the crisis, the exhaustion in front of all these difficulties. And so there is, as we were saying, like an unrocking as well. The signori, for example, fortify the city space much more than had been before. It was more open, like for the citizenry. Now it's basically ruled, as we've seen, in a sort of so-called tyrannical way, even though these were actually still the single most republican regimes in Europe. I made a video specifically about this paradox in historiographical terms definition. The only infantry that maintains sort of a greater, say, a bit like the same relevance than before are crossbowmen, and specifically like the more properly professional ones that, as we've seen, had already a bit this higher quality compared to the rest of the footmen. Also in the previous period, the one of the greater expansion of the communal army. It's not to say, of course, that there weren't, professional pikemen or pavismen, etc. We discussed this in the last episode. But let's say, especially with that massive crushing capacity that cavalry had, we have the Visconti and the De La Scalas fielding literally 5,000-6,000 men-at-arms, right, all mounted, right. This is, and say these are the largest armies in Europe after the one of France. That overwhelming cavalry shock force was practically rendering at least redundant such large amount of infantrymen, especially in such a moment in which, like, the people, whether the citizens or the peasants, were sort of exhausted and even rejecting war in this populistic stance for which it was better to have an autocrat telling them what to do as opposed to continue like risking their life. It was actually a dramatic moment. One has to understand that, but these dynamics always basically reappear in times of crisis historically. Crossbowmen had the advantage of being able to operate on broken terrain in open order, and to comfort in this way, also very flexible, because they could run without having, in fact, to maintain formation like the say large blocks of pikemen. Next to cavalry in many different circumstances, making things faster even, especially still trying to attack the enemy cavalrymen from the flank and the rear, the unprotected underbelly of the horses, etc. Right. As we will see now, also in terms of arms and armor, of course, again, there is plenty of development in sort of foot melee weaponry. We talked about this also in that recent video about medieval pole arms, because Italy has some of actually the greatest development in the polyfunctionality of especially the bill, right? That is often brought up just like, well, normally in the English context, but actually, like in Italy, was the thing. And we have, of course, an important precocity in the development of firearms in the Italian peninsula. It's not much, as we were saying in the last episode, that again the Italians would have had like the most advanced technologies. As always, like, technologies do travel, people know how to do things, but you also need to invest in order to develop them at some level. So actually, these were spreading pretty much all over Europe, except Italy, as we've seen, had this massive amount of wealth and very high level, perhaps the very highest level of belligerence in the entire continent. And as a consequence, some of the finest weaponry, including artillery, in this incredibly heavily fortified region, with the cities and the castles and all, some of the most advanced, in fact, say development, military engineering, would really require that. But again, the primate in the appearance of this is not so relevant after all, because there is only partially, like, say, systemic reason to find the first evidence of guns here or there, right? We have at least some, that there is a terminological problem, because some weapons are quite surely firearms, but we don't know exactly what. Right, it's a bit like crossbows. If you look at the sources in this context, like, you know that there was a multitude of other traditional artillery that we don't know whether, like, how they were built, like if they were large crossbows or not. At least we know that all these varieties existed, but we're not specifically told by the say, in a technical, categorical, linear sense, right? And this is totally normal for medieval times. The same applies to firearms. For example, the clearest reference to these firearms are from Florence in 1326, from Friuli in 1331, even more certainly from Lucca in 1341. We have, however, earlier, much more ambiguous, let's say, records, for example, from Forlì as early as 1284, talking of sclopeti or sclopi, which were probably handheld guns, like so handguns of some sort, as they would later develop, in fact. In the art of war of the Middle Ages, firearms do not really impact too much the tactical variables until the second half, right, of the 15th century. At this point, of course, these guns are being used, but the more traditional technologies are overall way more relevant and performing. In Italy especially, that was actually the country in which firearms, sort of handguns, developed in a more substantial way than in any other place. It's only in the 70s and in the 80s that you have like a neatly outlined infantry specialty armed with handguns, this Schiopetti, as a matter of fact, that can put up like a relevant volume of fire as a relevant arm on the battlefield. So that admittedly do change a bit forever as a consequence from that point onwards. We find, of course, bombers or field pieces, even more commonly found in pretty much all over Italy, and even in such an isolated mountainous region as Savoy, and in otherwise backward areas such as the Papal States, at least compared to Italian standards. Again, all these places begin to produce guns. Actually, it's even more common to see smaller cities that sort of specialize in production of this stuff for the bigger ones, which sort of makes sense, especially as we have highlighted in the previous videos, how interconnected and essentially parallel in any political, military, and social development central northern Italian city-states really were. So finally, we pass to the iconographic / archaeological evidence. I have divided this in different groups. We'll talk initially about like how Italy fits overall, like the broader Western European, say, way of war, and how you find this influences also, of course, from France and Germany specifically, because these were essentially the most active and interconnected country in the continent at the time. Then, not sure how much it will take, but we will pass to that, say, criticism on Nicole's ideas regarding, say, at least whether what we see in terms of something similar to what happened in the Byzantine or Islamic world is really the fruit of a contact between the Italians and those cultures, or is something sort of more autochthonous developing for, say, practical reasons. Then we will talk about what we can recognize as a truly more distinctively autochthonous Italian style in arms and armor, which is also relevant, definitely. And we talk about shields, mostly pavises, in this case, then guns, and then also bows, right, for what we can, of course, appreciate from the sources that, remember, are also iconographically showing you certain things. Doesn't matter, say, whether the better or the worse, more often the better, of course, but let's say also certain contexts that are like, it's not that we have a painting in medieval history that truly shows us how, for example, a medieval army was arrayed, right? So we have to assume this, we have to be careful, because again, the way I organize this series mostly talks about the visual side of the story, but the introduction is necessary, as well as other videos from other series about, for example, tactics and army organization, etc., to correctly frame what this warfare was really about, which is, at the end of the day, the main reason why I'm here, really. So we have an ivory box from Farfa, the famous Abbey of Latin. This is preserved in the treasury of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome. This box is dated to roughly 1071, and it shows some features. For example, a hat or helmet with a knob on top, then a sword with a horizontal, almost crescent-shaped pommel, curchion, tapering blade. Tapering blade, we know, is essentially the indicator of this trusting anti-armor sort of development of the blade, like generally mostly from a Frankish origin. However, even though indeed these features seem to be associated, even to be recurring, right? Specific characteristics that would present themselves later north of the Alps, it's been suggested that there may be some sort of Byzantine, even Islamic influence of some sort. And again, this is debatable. We'll find this kind of criticism throughout this various example. Then we have, and I made a video entirely about these splendid figures, at least the video is specifically about the knights that are a bit all sort of standardized in type, and the ones that appear, because I think they represent the single, not the same person, but of course the various eras of, in fact, what is the legion of King Arthur, and represented in the on the north door of the Modena Cathedral. These are carved reliefs dated to 1106, 1110, and they are a splendid representation of what a Western European knight looked like at this point. This is the Porta Pescaria of the Modena Cathedral, and one of the this is a very famous carving, relief carving, and it shows us, as you were saying in that video, how essentially the Italian panoply, the Italian knightly panoply, and not only was virtually identical to the one of Germany and France. So typically we see here long-sleeved male hauberks, at this early, still without mittens, which kind of makes sense, but including coif, which is not even there to be given for granted instead. So again, remember, this is art, so of course it is very accurate overall, but we don't have a photograph of what like an average Modenese knight looked like. Of course, this is the closest, at least we have to it. Actually, only with one exception, the coif go across the lower part of the face of these knights. This is fascinating, because normally, you know, the such almost Aventail style of protection is associated to context which was a lot of missile around, right? But not all, of course, that's not the only way where you would protect yourself in that way. We don't see like armor, interestingly enough, which also doesn't necessarily make much sense, because in the same figure we see actually pretty aggressive infantrymen that we know in the Po Valley being that sort of anti-cavalry effective. If you see here like the pickaxes that they're using, like that's sort of pretty convincing in this very heavily, you see here, fortified, at least you don't, but it's scattered throughout the entire picture. It cannot be really, you can check the video out, right? Heavily fortified contexts with mobile fortifications, etc. The helmets are conical with substantial nasals. Shields are of the long and kite-shaped variety, which again is pretty normal. This would have protected both from like the mounted as the foot counterparts. All the horsemen, including one unarmored one, carry heavy lances. There's massive, almost like barge poles, right? And some are also decorated with large and fringed gonfalons, The men also have remarkably short swords. The scabbards are worn outside their hauberks, apparently. There is this infantry guy wielding like a pickaxe or maybe an early form of warhammer. And again, it's an incredibly detailed and precious evidence of what was like basically near the standard of not just Italian but European, Western European cavalry this time. We have also the beautiful carved reliefs from the Cathedral of San Donnino near Fidenza, still northern Italy. As Emilia, essentially, like it would be Lombardy as a whole, like because at the time also Modena, in a say imprecise sense, were considered Lombardy as a whole. Here we are around 1200 chronologically. We see the illustration on the facade of the Story of the Knight Milo. The military equipment is dramatically advanced compared to like contemporary Italian sources. As well, we see that we're not kidding, as we observed throughout the episodes. We see separate male coif. Male hauberks have long sleeves, though they still lack mittens. We see male shows. Swords are still of the broad, blunt-ended type, which would have been more common in the Mediterranean world, but say in the broader Frankish area, like post-Carolingian area, we're developing, as we've seen, in the more tapering direction. This depends also on the sword, and like you can do still similar things with the same type, but in general, that's a vectorial indicator. There is a large, seemingly composite bow. We say so because it has a recurved shape. The arrows are simply thrust into a belt, which also would have not been typical, presumably. And anyway, we see here and there this sort of more Eastern influence. This is longitudinally at countries that are fairly, say, inland in a Western direction, like Scandinavia, Germany, Italy. They all have their share of Eastern influences. On this, there is no doubt. So there is still like scale armor, some sort like this greater sort of missile influence from places where also composite bows were used. And again, we will partly see this better later. As you understand, Italian cathedrals are a pretty rich source of so much of this beautiful art and iconography. For example, on the west front of the Lucca Cathedral, we have some beautiful relief carvings dating to the early 12th century. Here we are obviously in Tuscany. There are two warriors showing an interesting panoply, right? Round helmets with short nozzles and clothes wound around them. One helmet has apparently partial comber crest. We see hauberk, possibly of scale or lamellar, as we were just saying, with seemingly even a scale or lamellar coif. It could be as it happens often in Western art, like an association to some sort of infidel, conventionalized, and would say its scale of lamellar is, associated with this. But the mere fact that it's represented in this frangent, and generally speaking, was known in the region is very important. There is a similar hauberk, in fact, seen on what is a member of the Milanese city militia or a dismounted knight. We don't understand in that case. On the Roman Gate of Milan, this is a very famous source. We will see it later. So yes, again, this type of armor was used also, specifically in that scale type. We see long-sleeved male hauberks as well, kite-shaped shields with large bosses that were naturally adding to the smashing capacity. Like if you get that in the teeth, it doesn't feel really good. There is a sword with a massive pommel. We see probably what is a composite bow, all scattered around across the facade. 2 maces with fluted winged heads. Also a broad-bladed spear with long flanges. These are all very interesting weapons that suggest probably some sort of more Eastern influence of some sort, but they may have been, well, say, fitting this also heavily armored context as well. Then we have in the west front of the Church of Saint Zeno in Verona, Roland and Farragut depicted in a carved relief. We are around 1138. These warriors are practically kept on in the same way. Farragut is distinguished by a cloth wound around his head, because of course it's not like more Eastern in devilish in nature. Interestingly enough, we have forward angled conical helmets, seemingly with face masks attached, right, which makes such type of facial protection one of the earliest representations in Western Europe, right? Remember, at this point, helmets were sort of evolving towards like that facial protection. And eventually, in the 13th century, you have the all-enclosed like great helm, right? And these eras, of course, would have been already pioneering part these developments. Unfortunately, we don't see too much because the carvings are very damaged, but surely there are very substantial nasals, male coif and hauberks. Farragut's hauberk is short-sleeved, which may be still a sort of an Eastern reference. Roland seems to have male shows as well. We see both figures carrying long, flat-topped, kite-shaped shields. They are armed with lances, plus they have tapering swords with straight quillon and large tear-shaped pommel. Even though it's not really clearly represented, we can see what could be at least the strap or belt, seemingly passing around Farragut's waist, from his cantle to his saddle pommel, right? And this is a means of fixing a man in his saddle, which was a great concern at the time because impact, which would regularly happen, like knights tended to be literally catapulted off the horse. We know from Spain, at least from Islamic sources, that Christian knights literally chained themselves to the saddle. So in we have a pretty rare documentary mention of this stuff, and so it's interesting here that there is something apparently connected with this. And also, by the way, and this is purely accidental, by the way, as a coincidence, in the same Verona, but later in the 14th century. And by the way, like the need would have not really changed over the centuries that much, right? At the Museo Leone of Vercelli in Piedmont, we have some stone mosaic coming from Lombardy as a whole, dated to the mid-12th century, depicting combat between Fel and a Christian warrior, right? And the main difference is actually a depiction also for the black soldiers that I made, like as a military historical units, also for some Sicilian mercenary of the same period. That sort of counterposes like the typical Christian and sort of Islamic infidel gear. In fact, the Christian guy, and it's made, this mosaic is in black and white, so it's probably like the opposite of one another. Like the Christian guy has this tall kite-shaped shield, and the black guy has this small, round, highly decorated shield, and it's also barefooted. And this makes actually one of the best depictions, again, of black troops from this European art. Both warriors have long, straight swords anyway, which naturally depended on the circumstances. At the Diocesan Museum of Trent, we have a frontispiece of a Tuscan Bible dated to the second quarter of the 12th century. This came from Florence, really, and it shows helmets with angled crowns and nozzles, one of which seems to be attached to the rim as opposed to the bowl of the helmet. See a male hauberk with long but very wide sleeves, and a sword with an acutely tapering blade, which is a relatively unusual feature so early in the 12th century. There are also remarkably short spears or javelins shown. A beautiful great helm appearing in literally all the books about medieval arms and armor is preserved at the Museum of Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, coming from the Trentino, right? And it is very much German. However, it's also typical, essentially, of how the ones like the great helm, of course, as it would have developed in Italy in the first place. It dates this beginning of the 14th century. It's relatively early flat-topped in style, which thus gave little protection to the neck and throat, in a sense, because the more curved type would have deflected hits better. We have in the Church of St. Martino in Lucca carved relief depicting the martyrdom of St. Regulus, dating to 1233. We see a broad-bladed, blunt-ended type of sword, which still appears in 13th century Italian art. This is connected in part also to sort of Byzantine art style, etc. And we think that especially by this point it had become some sort of unrealistic archaism. But I think it's still possible, of course, that similar weapons still existed. Again, this is a very heavily armored context. We've seen it. We'll keep seeing it. You have very advanced sort of penetrating type of, in sword specialties. But hey, it's still a sword. It still works. Why not, right? Maybe older, say, more anachronistic swords had also been treasured, had survived somewhere, etc. Also, bit unlikely as well in this rendition of the sword is the reverse curved guillon, right? It is not much of a thing. The Arian heretic represented in the story of Saint Regulus is depicted with a long-headed and perhaps fluted mace, which may be connected, as we were saying, hinted at before, with some sort of more Eastern influence of sort. But it also simply indicates, wherever there is mace, there is armor as well. And the Italians, as we'll see, developed their own anti-armor weapons in that effective way as well. From the 90s of the 13th century, have a beautiful depiction of Ferrarese knights from the local seal of the Guild of St. George. This is preserved at the Department of Seals in the British Library of London. I made one of the very early videos, like in 2018, from this, right? And today I would remake the videos others that I made at some point, but it's a beautiful depiction. It shows in part the presence of some again, arms and armor features that would appear elsewhere in Europe only substantially later in time, showing how advanced, again, the Italian panoplies really were for the times. For example, full plate greaves, possibly sabatons worn with a fluted pointed pollain. And this guy is a knight, by the way, and he wears a coat of plates with a scalloped lower edge. This is normally not seen well into the 14th century. We see a laminated or scale-covered skirt. This may be actually a Byzantine archaism, like just in a iconographic, like artistically licentious way. The same can be said for the flowing cloak and the bare right arm that are just a bit more heroic. In any case, we see also a pretty common flat-top shield and a fully developed great helm that fit the times. We have unfortunately, we don't actually have anymore because it's lost. We have the depiction of, let's say, the effigy of Peter of Savoy, Earl of Richmond. We are in the late 13th century. I made multiple videos on like the importance of, at least we're talking about Angevin England, the importance of Savoy, Savoyards at the courts of kings like John, Henry III, Edward I. This effigy, by the way, can be found represented in the former Archaeologia volume 18, dating to 1870. And this effigy used to lie in the church of Egbel, but it went destroyed apparently in the first half of the 19th century. Now, the reason why we cover essentially this French context is that Savoy, I made a video about Savoy some time ago. We'll have to keep talking more about Savoyard history because it's really important. And that's the same reason why we remember Peter, that was a very international figure, very involved in English, French, and northern Italian politics. These were, as you know, a very important nobiliar dynasty from the higher Middle Ages that came really to live a bit in the myth of chivalry and had a very important military curriculum as well. And this effigy really shows a typically late 13th century equipment. Male coif, long-sleeved male hauberk with mittens, almost certainly male chausses, sword having a large pommel, broad flat-top kite-shaped shield. This is how you would have seen literally the guy going around. Then we have yet another very important, famous, say, representation of medieval knight from the age, literally, of the Battle of Campaldino. Here, this was realized in the 90s. The battle was in 1289, and it represents William Baraldus, right? That essentially was the guy who commanded. He was a Frenchman, commanding the Guelph army, the Florentine army, at Campaldino, and they made this carved relief on his tomb depicting him, and it is famously preserved at the convent of the Annunziata in Florence. And it's really one of the most famous sources for Italian armor during the late 13th century, and especially of the so-called Guelph Angevin, Tusco-Angevin style that essentially was developed because of the strong axis existing between the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Italian Guelphs and the papacy. We see the horsemen wearing a conical, perhaps fluted helmet with a very small brim. This is sort of unusual because these are features that the helmet has both with the cervelière that was coming to be like mostly like the thing worn, if anything, underneath the great helm, and the early bassinet as well. And this helmet is probably worn over a coif rather than having its own aventail. The knight has a long-sleeved mail hauberk with finger mittens, mail chausses, perhaps laminated or scale-lined sabatons. The legs are protected by sheets of apparently like cuir bouilli, so hardened leather. This is one of the main characteristics of the Tusco-Angevin style, like this sort of lighter gear, in part said because of Southern Europe, like because of the weather, like the hot climate during the season, but also because Tuscany was not too rich in metal. Right? It was mostly Lombardy had the most advanced arms and armor production in Europe, and so this was, however, like a compromise because apparently the French would fight what was believed to be a slightly lighter and more specialized, like sort of combined armed style compared to the heavier Germans that were instead more stereotypically about like the full, say, the plate armor, the great helm, as we've seen, larger swords. Actually, the French and German knights, or the Italian knights, went at war, as we'll see now, pretty much in the same way. But the idea is this: stereotypically, there is this sort of more this lighter style from the Welsh side of the story. This cuir bouilli forms greaves, a specialized type of cuisse, and a pollen. The last, however, being of metal. We see the fleur de lis on the upper part of his surcoat. This is very much because of the French monarchy, but also the Florentine symbol. I made a video about ancient Florence explaining the origin of the city's fleur de lis, that in this sense suited also very well with the French alliance of the Tuscan city. That was the most important strategic center in the Guelph axis, like in Italy. The latter, like this, the fleur de lis are represented also as decorations surrounding, to some extent, hiding the outer rivets of a coat of blades. So this it actually is a pretty heavy equipment, but sometimes we don't see exactly what's underneath. You see typically late 13th century sword and shield, the latter becoming smaller, essentially, because of this, as you understand, increasingly, stratified and effective armor. Other Tusco-Angevin characteristic, the large dagger, right? This is the idea. At the Battle of Benevent, the French knights literally wrestled with the German heavier ones, and being more agile, they could stick these daggers into their armpits that were not protected by armor. That idea of the lighter thing. And if anything, iconographically, this type of large dagger is not normally seen elsewhere in Western European art until the 14th century. We don't know what's going on, whether it's more like a French or a Tuscan thing. Specifically, we're told in the same Battle of Campaldino that there were some actually Aretinians from the other side that disemboweled enemy horses with daggers, like getting under their bellies. So we don't know. Also, at this level, somebody said maybe it's a Byzantine influence or whatever, but realistically, like large daggers would also sort of develop in these regions a bit on their own. We have the beautiful wall painting of the Church of St. John in Latin Gate in Rome, dating to the early 13th century. And we see an angel wielding a massive sword that is probably just like an artistic exaggeration. In any case, it does represent a heavy, broad-bladed weapon. Perhaps the era of Rome was more subject again to that sort of Byzantine influence, in which sort of more cutting element is preferred as the thrust. But these blades were massive things, like wielded surely by by knights, but sort of very well-grown people, and were terrifying just to see them, like in combat. And you can imagine the damage they could have. We see a long curved quillon, which is somehow normally, while the almond-shaped pommel is rather unusual. Now, at the Dante Hall in the town museum of San Gimignano, Tuscany, we have some of the most also beautiful, famous paintings, depictions of knights for in the history of Italian arms and armor. These wall paintings were made between 1280 1292. Right. We see a variety of helmets: a small-brimmed chapelle de fer with coif or likely aventail, a pointed great helm, a large helmet with movable visor type as well. We see hauberks worn beneath surcoats, two of which are slit down at the front. There is one instead being decorated, the upper edge, and having a somewhat pronounced chest, which may be that inside a coat of plate or some form of cuir brillant was attached. Of course, we can't see underneath, but these solutions would have been frequent. We see all knights having mail shows. We see plate arm and leg defenses. These are really important because they're fairly early in time, and they show how, as we were saying before, yes, Tuscany would have less metals locally, but it's not, they couldn't purchase, import like they had actually some of the richest communities around, especially at this moment of rampant financial boom in the wealth field. San Gimignano is not this overwhelmingly powerful commune, by the way, but of course, like the local magnates would have ample means to arm themselves and participating also in the various wars in Tuscany. We see again other highly decorated surfaces that we can't tell again what material they are because it's just a painting, but they are likely decoratively tooled leather, say hardened leather armor, right? We see among these pieces also shoulder roundels, rear brace, van braces. So the hands may have padded gauntlets. Leg defenses include greaves. We see a rounded pollane in all cases, by the way. The latter are attached to some sort of more flexible cuisse. Some extend way below the knee. We see lances, tapering swords with long quillon and large pommels. We see a large basilar dagger on a knight's hip. All the shields are large, flat-topped, and kite-shaped, with a distinct curvature as well. 3 horses out of 4 wear caparisons that do not cover the animal's head. However, in one case, the horse is also defended by a chanfron, right? Frontal, like forehead armor, right? We have preserved at the Royal Library of Brussels. This is the manuscript 10,168 72 at the volume 168 verso. A manuscript on the Fête des Romains, and this was produced in Rome, and it represents, of course, Romans. It dates to 1293, And it's a very interesting manuscript because its illuminations are particularly up to date, like especially what was the late 13th century Roman or at least Central Italian sort of arms and armor. Like they look very let's say unstylized. Like there's no archaism, at least an apparent one. We see oval shields, which we have observed in different contexts. Like for example, in the Crusaders infantrymen episode from the historical military units series. We've seen at this time there were actually Central Italians from Spoleto fighting at the siege of Acre, even resisting well later on their positions compared to even to actual knights. These were common soldiers, and as we have observed in the previous episode, of course, Italy had the finest infantry at the time. You see men wearing full mail hauberks with mittens, mail coif. We see just an old-fashioned nasal, right? The remaining troops have, great helms with round or pointed tops, with both types. We see a tapering sword with a diamond-shaped pommel and downturned guillon. And again, we can imagine pretty much like Roman Central Italian knights at this time looking pretty much like this. There is a very famous representation, I think I inserted it at the beginning of the former video, that is comes from the source, that is the address from the city of Prato, Tuscany, to King Robert of Naples. And this essentially depicts an Angevin knight from the Neapolitan kingdom, but it's just in the typical Tuscan fashion. Like, they would have looked the same also because they were very much in contact with one another. This dates to the early 14th century, and the source is preserved at the British Library of London. We see essentially a visored great helm, which is quite interesting. The visor seems inched, and in a way that reminds of what would be the shortly afterwards appearance of the same system on, however, the much smaller basilisk. This is like a full, like big, great helm for knights, and again, it's just a side look. The comparison is very beautiful and all, like an interesting piece of art in itself. There is a series of very beautiful tomb slabs depicting the very elaborated Italian panoplies of the time from people of very high status. And we will see some of them, especially when talking about probably the distinctively native Italian, mostly decoration, but styles, but also probably the arrangement, the way the armors were structured. One beautiful example of this is to be found at the Lapidarian Museum of the Este in Modena, and we refer to the tomb slab of Bernardino de Baranzoni. Is a northern Italian man-at-arms. Unfortunately, the slab is broken, but it's still amazingly preserved, and it shows some information that is really unknown elsewhere, such as an extra flap from the male aventail, right, hanging almost like a curtain around the man-at-arms neck. We see male bretache, details of his sword belt and sword hilt, his arm defenses that are perhaps the most fascinating thing. We see the mail of a long-sleeved hauberk, the armpits and around the lower arms are covered in it. There is a decorated couteil under his on his elbow. There's a tubular rerbras going around his upper arm. Considering from the rivets of armor we can say that this was a splintered construction with some decorative fabric or leather covering, which was also quite common. Remember that armor was normally all colored, in part by means of these textile covers, or could be lacquered in the case of plate. It was spreading at this point. We've seen even there were some combinations with the cuir as well. We see this flap of mail hanging from the rear brace over the elbow, which could be just like an additional piece on its own, fastened to the rear brace, or indicating two mail hauberks, or a hauberk and a shorter haubergeon, both worn beneath the coat of plates, which, by the way, this makes a heavily ultra-armored guy for the time. And again, this is truly like the elite. If you look at remember, these are the Italians that, there weren't too many Italians fighting as knights compared to the foreign mercenaries at this point. They were chosen exactly for that, but these are properly the guys from those powerful nobiliary patrician clans that still represent the single most developed, ultra heavily armored and ultra knightly professional component of the local armies, right? And so they show it, of course. We see likely no plate pieces attached to his gauntlets. The wrist area may be of stiffened leather. Another very famous source preserved at the Castelvecchio Museum of Verona, and we talked about this in the video about medieval Verona, are actually the Scaliger tombs, including like these beautiful statues on the same sarcophagi. We talk about the one of Can Grande della Scala. Right, we are in the 30s of the 14th century, died in 1329. It's a pretty big statue, by the way. This museum is preserved. It's basically outside the church of Saint Mary the Ancient. We see bassinet, aventail, bertache. Interestingly enough, like the great helm is slung on his back, but it looks rather uncomfortable in that sense. Perhaps the Can Grande would have preferred the saddle as another location, like to hang it. And it's possible that the actual statue was in this sense rearranged, right, during some restoration, right? Because of course helmets were also slung with the chains attached to the chest, like back on the back, in fact. But who knows? We were not sure 100% in this case in representation. Can Grande wears a mail hauberk, light gauntlets. We're practically sure a coat of plates. At this point would have been obvious. Full leg harness, polaines, greaves, sabatons, like the full package. The horse's caparison or bard may have like some extra protective layer. The animal has chamfron with semi-domed eye caps. There's a bit of protection for the horse. This is a man who literally spent his entire life on horseback, commanding armies or more. The other figures, of course, is his nephew, Mastino II. His names were all about hounds because they were loyal, like in the feudal symbolism, to the empire. These were imperial bikers for the Trevisan mark. It's also the time under which Verona reached the peak of power, expanding up to central Italy, rivaling with the Visconti. The statue of Mastino II dates to 1351. It's in the same place, same location of Can Grande's. And this also is pretty normal mid-14th century Italian armor. The only unusual stuff is the broad strap leading over his thighs from the cantle to be fastened to the pommel of his saddle, right? And we have already seen this before for that depiction of Farragut, and this is exactly the other Veronese representation of the same. Other very famous piece of art, because this is what we're talking about besides the strictly military historical side of the story, but that's what essentially Italians were also looking at with the celebration of this now Condottieri, is the very famous wall painting of Guido Riccio da Fogliano by Simone Martini, dating to 1328, preserved at the public palace of Siena. This guy was like an all-round condottiere who fought for Siena, the command of the communal army against the rival Grosseto. And the Sienese thanked Guido Riccio for his services. And this is typically, by the way, again, one of those Apenninic condottieri that we're talking about in the other episodes, coming from places like Emilia, Romagna, especially the Tosco-Romagnol Apennine that served in these other more powerful valley cities that were in fact essentially selected since their youth. But there was probably a curriculum, a series of tests, commanding this series of units increasing in size and seeing if they were good at it. And it's one of the best. Guido Riccio is one of the best early condottieri commanders. There are numbers. This is not just about his equipment, but we see, for example, the background representing siege warfare. We see a large infantry mantlet behind. The horseman has discarded, in this case, much of his armor. The remaining one is an hauberk with long, broad sleeves and a raised, stiffened collar. The leg harness is also very complete. We see some bulbous polanes, probably attached to the lower part of the cuisse. Mail fringes, short mail fringes are added to this. We see metal greaves made in two sections, probably inched up the outside. We see mail shows with the extent to cover Guido Riccio's feet. His sword is hung in sort of the new way, with a sword belt fastened to a pair of asymmetrically placed rings. The caparison is lined with a mail or at least thick felt of some sort. There is a rigid chamfron with semi-domed eye, as we've already seen. Semi-domed eye protection, essentially, worn beneath the caparison. Naturally, again, this is not the full way he would go out in combat, right? But of course, wearing armor constantly, fully was too demanding, bodily, and so it was just mostly the celebratory way of also representing the actual guy without helmet, with his face recognizable. We have in the church of Saint Giusto in Susa, we are essentially in a here Savoyard context, at least because it was ruled by already these lords, the metalwork of La Madonna del Rocciamelone. It dates to slightly later to our timeline, 1358. There is a strong French influence in this area, of course, because the Susa Valley opens goes to France, basically. We see a straightforward great helm with a massive crest. The rings at bottom rim could be just to hold a chin strap or additional mail flap. We see a tall visored bassinet mail aventail. The coat of plates has rivets visible on the shoulders and around the waist. Mail is worn underneath. His arms have fully plated rear brace, côté, avant-bras, and gauntlet. The rivets of the cuisse are Above his plate paulines and greaves, below which are laminated sabatons. We see a small dagger worn on the hip, spear, a roundel covering the hand. This is similar to Mastin II's statue, as far as the figure is secured in the saddle by a strap from cantle to pommel. Right. The shield has almost a rectangular top and a rounded base. The horse has chamfron. There is a small pétrade to protect his chest. Horse armor is not that frequent, even like of course numerically just an ultra elite of cavalry has, right? But it's from the late 13th century that we start seeing it well represented in general in Western art, and distinguishing it from, like, sometimes we don't understand whether it's, for example, like comparison, like it's fabric or leather even, but then we understand properly, like there is metal barding at some point, and so these pieces were added just normally for protecting the more vital parts, of course, of the animal most exposed in the charge, like the forehead and the chest. We see the seal of Count Amadeus IV of Savoy, dating to the early 14th century, preserved at the National Archives of Paris. Even though it's a Savoyard seal, it's sort of similar to what can be found in central Italy, Lombardy. It's actually an old-fashioned armor, which happened, like I am, for example, writing an article about a Swabian guy of the same time that has sort of more archaic panoply. He fought in Italy, incidentally, and he was in his 50s, 60s at the time. So it's possible that the way he was represented in his seal was sort of nostalgic, right? We don't have to think these representations being 100% what these guys would have looked on the battlefield. Sometimes they are, sometimes maybe they're not. The guy is French-looking, essentially. He has an almost flat-topped great helm, long-sleeved mail hauberk, one mitten dangling from the wrist, at least it seems, likely mail shows, flat-topped kite-shaped shield. It has a massive sword that, however, is only slightly tapering. The horse has chamfron over a cloth caparison, it seems. That we have pretty interesting evidence from the wall paintings of the church of Santa Bondio in Como, north of Milan. This area borders with the Kingdom of Germany. These paintings date between the 30s and the 50s of the 14th century. They represent mostly, again, religious themes, the way to Calvary, betrayal, crucifixion, etc. The interesting thing about these paintings is that they represent mainly, say, not to be given for granted subject of heavily armed and armored as well infantry, right? Mostly, right? Which is what you don't often see, right? Also in other important representations. This territory was controlled by Milan, and we have seen also in the previous episodes how this was the most successful military power in Italy. Controlled also the best arms and armor production. The commune issued, like also to the other like communes that had subjected at this point as a signory, the pretty high standards of equipment, even for infantry, right? There's a bit of archaism we can excuse poetically, artistically, such as the splinted pendant upper arm defenses and skirts, and that are associated actually mostly with the officers represented. This is like a heroic, like sort of Roman kind of influence, and it's okay. It's Byzantine art at Similia. They're not some of the most important features. So they do not alter much this depictions that, by the way, most of the time in this case, again, way to Calvary, crucifixion, etc., are meant to represent Roman troops, right? The ancient Romans in the Bible. Now, the rest of the arms and armor are instead very straightforward and accurate, realistic. We see bassinets worn by most troops, some have aventails, some at least apparently without. We see stiff mail collars, which, considering all the crossbow fire that existed in Italy, actually made sense. These collars, we've seen it also with Guido, etc., were connected, are to be found, for example, also in the Balkans, in the Eastern Balkans, where there's a lot of Turkish archery at this point, and some Serbian armor, for example, is quite typical about this reinforcement at the neck. We saw it in the video about Eastern Balkan warfare of the same kind. We see, because of the man's long hair, that helmets and collars are not jointed in this armor. We see an unfastened male bretage facial protection, at least in only one case. We see angled and clearly hinged nozzles. One has a fastening point on the aventail, like one just rivet. One has a bassinet without an aventail. A couple of times you have a helmet that really looks like an early form of salad. This is something that we have seen often in general, like especially this type of, especially sort of before time bassinets, especially from the Mediterranean, that seen it especially in Spain, places like this, but also Italy, as we've seen, has quite interesting sort of earlier, like before time stuff. All these helmets have central columns and also a neck guard that is made from a evidently separate piece of metal. Think about this, like these soldiers also fighting against all those heavily armored, knights, men at arms. May make more sense than we think. It's like gives an idea of very, very heavily armored infantry, right? Capable of withstanding a lot of stuff. For not saying else, we see a similar helmet without a nozzle. Some helmets are actually brimmed chapelle de fer. There is an obscured visor helmet worn with a massive barbuta. Right, these barbutas appear with a war hat in a bassinet. This type of armor was quite common, like to give the name properly to the single man at arms. You see a raised, stiffened, and clearly thickly padded mail collar as part of mail hauberks. Right. Figures that wear only such mail hauberk and no plated body armor. This is interesting, but one can't see the most immediate reason for this, because at least it's more like another piece being covered rather than being like a wholly different type of, say, layer type of armor. You see hauberks worn over substantially kilted gambesons, reaching below the knees. The sleeves are much more thickly padded above the elbow than on the lower arms. Sort of makes sense, as we've seen also with the Rarbrasse. One garment has puffed sleeves and it's probably worn over a gambeson. We see also various figures with separate mail gauntlets. A few have leg armor greaves. in one case clearly buckled on the inside of the calf. We see in other cases, at least from the different shape, the armor being around the wearer's ankles. We see two types of sabatons, the normal laminated one and a pair made of linked scales, apparently. We see rare brasse, probably of hardened leather. We see a cuirass apparently made of segments. Maybe it's leather. And it's not really understandable even from the people were wearing this in the biblical scenes exactly what function may have. Now shields are also very interesting. The ordinary ones are flat topped. One has apparently metal butt fixed to it. Then we see the larger round top kite shape ones with a spike attached to the base. The latter may be some sort of mantlet which could be fixed into the ground. And we talked about this regarding the pavis and the idea that we have sort of developed of that. They're properly mantlets rather. And they, again, the terminology can vary depending on what we're looking at, also not just historically but historiographically. In any case, like especially a larger shield, right, could be fixed onto the ground. Be normally just also because of relief. Like, have you ever carried a luggage of 8 kilos? 8 kilos was a Roman scutum, right? You have with your arm alone, you have to put it on the ground for hours of engagement, right? And so the idea is that, of course, these mantlets could provide with some sort of shield wall together, but you don't have to think of this as also dramatically. I mean, shield walls are overrated in warfare in the first place, just like what you can use to protect yourself, say, in an emergency situation against somebody who's shooting at you, and that's basically it. And there is even a sort of third type of shield, a small sausage buckler, sausage-shaped buckler, fastened to a man's lower right arm. This doesn't have to be underestimated. Many shields were actually slung also, like larger ones over the shoulders, etc. The guy seems more like an officer, some sort of NCO. We see really a variety of weaponry, by the way. Daggers ranging from small knives to full-size baselets. There aren't so many swords. We see maces, though. Some are winged or flanged, and those were popular. And if you look at all this armor around, it sort of makes a lot of sense. Like, these were used to smash armor at this very heavy level. Then we see in the castle of Sabbionara, the wall paintings depicting the battles of Guelphs and Ghibellines, dating to the 40s of the 14th century. Now, the background is interesting because, first of all, it's a very important and detailed source for our military stuff. This is debatably also even more important than the Como wall paintings, as far as the military detail is concerned. The paintings of the Avio castles were commissioned by the Veronese Castelbarco family that were Ghibelline as hell, and they essentially wanted this art to represent their wars against the bishops of Trento that were instead Guelphs. And so there is some motive in here. The figure of St. George is interesting, and it actually seems to be more conventional than the rest of the sources, maybe even copied from an external one. The figure wears a round bassinet and aventail, male hauberk under a coat of plates. It's very heavy stuff. We can see part of the hauberk at the shoulder beneath the surcoat. The arms are protected by a rerbras and vanbras, but we don't see couture. The legs are fully armored in plate, cuisse, pollen, greaves, and sabatons. This type of armor is developing exactly in these years, that sort of full plate character. The second half of the 14th century sees more plate armor in general than the rest. The sword is long and tapering, with straight quillon and a round pommel. Swords naturally were becoming ever more structured to cope with plate armor, like rather than increasing like the cutting capacity, being probably the penetrating one, the smashing one actually, because of say unhinging the various the structure that kept together the plate as well, aside from still damaging it anyway. There is an object hanging from the sword belt on the right hip, which may have been a mean to hold a dagger. There is here like a distinctively northern Italian and even southern German style involved. Consider, as we've seen in the previous videos, that there was plenty of German mercenaries employed by the Italian seigneuries, and especially the big powerful ones of the north at this point. And in general, there were just lots of these mercenaries roaming around. Here, the La Scala dynasty has somehow collapsed, at least in its multi-regional domain, but it would keep using large amounts of German troops. It's not much about the quantity, it's about the entire environment where others had been released also out there after also the financial collapse of the seigneury. Some cavalry have great helms with lambrequin, massive crests. Most seem to have taller rounded bassinets with large movable visors and male aventails. You see some coats of plates as well, among various forms of plates, really, or splintered and riveted armed defenses as well, vambrases, rerbras, couture. We see gauntlets, leg harness consists of pollen, likely cuisse, greaves. We see also in this case fabric covering part of this greaves, like so splintered construction is present as well. We see as the only cavalry weapons lances, with or without hand protecting roundels. We see large swords, large daggers, pretty typical. Horses have caparisons or bards, and there is also here like a chamfron beneath the fabric with eye protections. So you understand how also this is getting a bit more of that heavier type that we were documenting before for the end of the period. Now I think today we can stop here. Generally speaking, we have seen the face, let's say, what you can argue being the more typical, so I would say not distinctively typical, but normally typical Italian arms and armor, more or less throughout the period. Understand the degree of advancement, especially the degree of armoredness towards the later period, late 13th, 14th century. And the level of advancement, in fact, of this technology, the complexity of defenses, the pretty straightforward as like compact, direct, smashing sort of context that we're talking about. There would be so much to discuss about telling the truth, especially as far as the level of interaction that we lastly observed also with Germany, for example. Remember also in the recent videos that we made about international trade, how Venice here, for example, we've just seen this northeastern Italian context. Well, there was probably a trade route between Venice, southern Germany. You have very next door, like again, essentially the proto-industrial arms and armor production. And the Germans start growing, part also under this, within the sphere of this Italian production. And there is surely a lot being exchanged between the two sides of the Alps, thanks also to the German mercenaries that really are at this time really the favorite sort of and more numerous of the mercenary type in the peninsula. There's probably a phase in which the Germans are sort of more prominent than there are other nationalities that arrive, but they are less of a role. Let's say they have their phase because this or that company arrived, but it's not like they stayed as long as the Germans had done probably in that large phase of expansion in Italian warfare, especially from the 10s to the 30s of the 14th century, and that's in fact what opens later the age of the Condottieri, say more classically meant, right? In the age of these mercenary companies, and the phase that has been sort of more dealt with historically and popularly, and that instead is sort of, at least for a while, for the 15th century again, it starts being really something. But in this period, like after the crisis, it's actually lamer, right? It may impress, but again, it's also like the same Italians that are using these guys to throw them against each other, and so everything is very clear when you explain the context, and sort of it makes much more sense than the usually more catastrophistic narrative that opens to this other phase of the Condottieri, right? But the previous phase was, right, incredibly important. We have covered it in the introduction, so you know what we're talking about. Now, next time we will be talking about instead the aforementioned Eastern influences in Italian warfare, presumed or real, and the timeline, in fact, is also very important. And then the more typically native Italian stuff, artillery, missile, right, this kind of thing. It has been taken quite a while now to go on with this series. Today I wanted to talk a bit more, but I think that the what I've left is enough for just a full fourth chapter, and then it's over. This was objectively the longest. Again, I made I think only maximum 2 episodes for region, but it was specifically France and the Byzantines. Well, Italy deserved, of course, for the obvious reason. This I think was one of the, see, even through a YouTube series you can appreciate at a point the relevance of this or that scenario, and that's essentially what we're looking at, what we're talking about, exactly to dimension it, right? This I'm going to finish this part of the branch. As I was saying at the beginning, we just have a couple of regions left in Europe, then more actually in the rest of Eurasia we still have to cover, but we'll have to insert another branch of the cycle. It may be Italy. I don't know, because we already have that. I have inserted an extra French, an extra German, and an extra Italian history branch in the for the medieval series in general, in the cycle. And yet so far it seems as if we didn't talk too much about them. And especially I realized that oddly we didn't talk too much at all about especially 15th century Italian history, which sort of doesn't make much sense also from a military point of view. And so we'll see, because also some evenemential history helps, right? This series is nice because it sort of encases everything in some sort of orderly category you can access, etc. Yes, but then you should go into the depths of the actual political and military events, and we barely did so. Excuse me, I drink a little. After COVID, I have this still cough. I drink a lot, get a bit of things to ease the thing, but I have to, especially if I talk too much, I dehydrate. I tend to cough once again. But I was saying again that we should find a way to be much more evenemential about history, because otherwise we don't know what we're talking about. It seems like there's one of you, I think today, who told me, "Oh my God, I thought that this was like a super." I don't remember what he said. I remember this thing about medieval Italy, something like super, not niche, but something, yeah, that apparently wouldn't be so much to talk about, and instead we, I think, made here 5 hours and a half overall, and we still have to finish this. Well, yeah, you see, this is the point. If I manage to give that sort of overall dimension through these chapters and saying, look, somebody has realized that this was important, more important than they thought, and as it gets closer to the objectivity of it all, this is really like it makes my day, and it makes me feel like Schwerpunkt wasn't that of a bad idea after all, right? It all depends on you, but so it is. So again, let's finish this next time. Then let's pass to the rest. I'm advantaging myself a lot because I prepared this video once, but of course I have other days spare to do other stuff. While every day I talk about this now, I alternate it with some other special, because otherwise it's too monotonous. But again, you get it just once, like at a time. At least this is what in this format, in this series, let's enjoy it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.